Sitecore Experienced, Episode 8, recorded September 4th and September 18th, 2015.
Welcome to Sitecore Experience.
Sitecore Experienced, a video podcast to showcase information related to Sitecore for the benefit of the Sitecore community.
Welcome to Sitecore Experienced. I'm one of your co-hosts, Jamie Stump.
And I'm Mark Survey.
So, Mark, one of the things that was announced a few months ago was that there was a new SDK for Xamarin that connects Sitecore with Xamarin. Xamarin, for those who don't know, is a cross-platform mobile app development language. And so that was pretty exciting news a few months ago. Not sure how many people have actually jumped into that SDK. But today our main topic speaker is going to be a Xamarin developer who's going to intro us to Xamarin so that hopefully we can start using it.
Yep. Yeah, and that will be here running up shortly. We've also, in the last couple of weeks, actually right after we recorded that session earlier this month, put out a survey and was looking for feedback. So the feedback that we got was really, really good. So we're cutting a few things out here. And based on that feedback and based on essentially where things were going in viewership and everything else, we've decided to hang it up. So we're going to run the gambit this year of what we have left on the schedule, and then we're going to call it a podcast for the year. We're going to just shoot probably through episode 9. I think I'm going to wrap it up with a speak presentation. Going to be pretty short, so the next episode will be just a main topic, more or less. While we'll stop doing the podcast, we may come back and do some special stuff. If one of us has something to share, we'll do that. We still have the module out there. So we'll be around, but we're just not going to be as active with the podcast anymore. And we're just going to do some other things. I wanted some other things that I wanted to jump into. Wasn't really able to do that with doing the podcast. I felt it was probably a good time to put my energy elsewhere. So I'm going to do that. I did want to make some notes, though, that we promised some people. One of the things that we got is talking with a coworker about a module he did called variable content. And we were going to showcase this episode. We're obviously cutting the segments out a little bit. Take a look at this. It's a nice little module. He's looking for some feedback. Tony did a really good job on this. So it's basically just being able to create reusable content. Not quite. It resembles a tokenizer, but it's not exactly a tokenizer. As far as the community, go check this one out.
Has a 5-star rating.
It has a 5-star. I didn't do it either. Give Tony some feedback on this. I know we have it on our roadmap, so I know Tony's looking forward to, everybody's feedback and making this thing better. So there it is. The other thing, Jamie, I'll let you talk about.
Sure. So during our marketplace happenings, Mark would often lament the fact that Marketplace is a little hard to find the most fresh modules or recently updated modules.
Just a little.
Just a little. So friend of our podcast, Michael West, realizes that Mark was, struggling to find things, decided to take matters into his own hands, and wrote a module that scrapes data from the marketplace and will be able to tell you what is the most recent content. So he's tweeted that out. If you go out to at Michael West 101 on Twitter, you'll find that tweet. I believe he may have shared that script. It's of course a PowerShell extension script because that's what Mike does, and it's an awesome module. So if you're interested in following up on Marketplace or knowing what's happening, which you should be because there's great modules out there, go check this out. Good job, Mike.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. No further ado, we're going to get you right into the main topic.
Let's
enjoy.
Do it. Zach Wegg has been writing mobile apps for approximately 8 years. He has worked with Java ME, iOS, Android, Symbian, Windows Phone, and finally, Xamarin. Coding is Zach's profession and his hobby. His other favorite activity is writing. In fact, I recently joined Zach's running club. Zach is sure I love it almost as much as Sitecore, but I'm not so sure. If you haven't figured it out now, Zach is going to be talking to us about Xamarin. Zach and I work together, and he's our mobile app guy, and I, approached him and said, hey, Sitecore has an SDK, and we'd love to hear about Xamarin, not being familiar with it. So he's going to give us the Xamarin developer's perspective. Zach, welcome to Sitecore Experience.
Hey, Zach.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right. Xamarin. Let's talk Xamarin. So, we have the SDK, as Jamie mentioned. So, what makes Xamarin a bit unique that people in the Sitecore community might want to know when they're thinking about this, knowing that there's an SDK out there?
Sure. Well, the first thing to know about Xamarin is that it's a native cross-platform solution for mobile. And it's not just mobile either. You can also use it for desktop, Mac, and Windows. So that makes it very unique, at least in the mobile space, because most mobile cross-platform solutions are web-based, basically using a native shell and then using the mobile web view, for instance, something like PhoneGap or Cordova. That's the common solution. So Xamarin's different because it's native and it's cross-platform in regards to the fact that it uses the Mono stack as basically its underlying architecture, and you write everything in .NET, specifically C#, VB if you really want to, but so you can do everything in .NET for iOS, Android, and Windows Phone, and Mac and Windows. So it spans quite an array of platforms.
Okay, what's the overhead on Xamarin when we take a look at that? Because we're covering various different architectures and topologies, right? So I would assume that the overhead would have to be somewhat a little heavy to be able to accomplish that, especially from C#.
Package-wise, you do need to include the .NET stack in your application. So that does increase the size of your overall deliverable as far as a mobile application goes, but it's negligible nowadays with the size of mobile applications, are in the order of tens of megabytes. So it's not too bad. I think, in 2008, 2009, it might have been an issue, but nowadays it's not a problem. You're going to have more problems controlling the amount of images you put into your mobile app and optimizing those than you are going to be impacted by the size of the additional libraries from Xamarin.
Okay, very good. That's good to know. I've always assumed, I think PhoneGap was a little heavy maybe, if I remember correctly. It's been a while, I don't remember. Like you said, you threw the dates out there. To me, that was an eon ago, in this world, right? So it's good to hear that has a light overhead. And with needing the .NET stack, that's pretty much for the Sitecore guys, that's already there. That's what Sitecore lives on top of as well. So I think we're all good there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the important part about Xamarin, especially for Sitecore, I guess, is that it uses Mono, which has been around through the 2000s, and is the port of .NET for various platforms like iOS, OS X, and Mono Droid is the Android port of .NET. And then, of course, you don't necessarily need all of that when you're running on Windows, but it gets the job done.
So, if I wanted to jump into Xamarin development, and I've already got my Visual Studio, do I need a plugin for Visual Studio, or how do I get started?
Yeah, so the first thing you'd want to do is probably go to Xamarin.com, create an account, and you can download the Visual Studio extension from there. I wouldn't do it necessarily through Visual Studio's extensions and tools update menu. Get it from Xamarin.com, and then that will get you set up with Xamarin as an extension for Visual Studio, and give you most of the tooling for Xamarin on your PC. That said, you can also use Xamarin's own IDE, Xamarin Studio. If you're comfortable with Visual Studio, I think the support for both is equivalent. So you don't, get better support or more features for Xamarin stuff with the Xamarin Studio IDE. I think that's mostly to attract developers from other platforms that aren't comfortable with Visual Studio or don't have a Visual Studio license. So basically, with Visual Studio, you get that extension, you're up and running, and then if you want to do other things with Xamarin, such as Xamarin Forms, which we can get into, you would get the NuGet package for your solution and add that to your projects as needed.
Okay. Is Xamarin Studio a free download as well?
Yes. Now, there's different licenses that offer you more things, paid licenses through Xamarin. I've been spoiled with the business license, so I can't exactly recall what you get with the free version, but I believe you get Xamarin Studio for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Are there more tiers than just the free and the business? What kind of tiered licensing system does Xamarin have?
It's basically a 3-tier system. I think they have also some stuff for students that gives you additional stuff, but you have your free, business, and enterprise. Enterprise basically adds on a few additional things, mostly like additional support. You get a Xamarin rep that you can talk to, and you get like a 1-day SLA, a turnaround on questions and bug fixes and stuff like that for the platform.
So more support oriented than actually product oriented then?
Yeah, feature wise, I think the business and enterprise license are in parity. There might be a few paid things like additional Xamarin plugins that you would get for free with the enterprise that you wouldn't get with the business license, but that's about it.
Okay.
Actually, not plugins, components.
I was going to ask that question. Yeah, because I wasn't sure if the plugin was the same as a component in Xamarin or if they were two different things.
They do have plugins on GitHub. They're small things. The Xamarin evangelist, James Montenegro, I think that's his last name, but he has a nice write-up on the difference between the plugins and the components and how Xamarin views those. But their plugins are really useful as well. They're on GitHub for free.
Okay, and they'll work obviously for free with any of the licenses, and everything's pretty cross-licensed. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Jamie, you were going to ask a question.
How about the front-end coding for Xamarin apps? Is it like web-based? Like, am I doing HTML? Am I doing MVC?
No. And this is my area that I like. So that's Xamarin Forms. Well, I guess not necessarily. So before you get to Xamarin Forms, you're going to make a Xamarin app, let's say. You're going to target iOS and Android from the mobile perspective. That's what I'm doing. And if you're not using Xamarin Forms, you're still doing native UI. So you're using storyboards in iOS or nib files, and I don't even know what it is in Android, AXML. That just shows, with Xamarin you don't need to know. That just shows how good Xamarin Forms is. But anyways, you would write your cross-platform, application logic, business logic, whatever, service layer, all with C#.net. And they also port the platform APIs to be used in C# as well. So you're not just using .NET APIs in C#, but you're also coding your platform specific code in C# as well, which is pretty cool. So you can mix and match your C# and like Objective-C, for instance. There's ways to do that in your application with Xamarin, but you don't need to at all. You can write everything in C#. Even the native APIs are written in C#. They've put a layer on top of that, so you don't have to code in Objective-C or Swift if you don't want to.
Have they done that just more from a preference standpoint for folks, or are there maybe more advanced aspects to Xamarin where you may need to actually separate that, or I should say combine those differently?
I think it does make I think it was for like a usability perspective. I do think it makes the development simpler. You're coding all in one language, and I think there's less complications with how you would architect your application in the source code. The way you divide up your projects and your assembly files, code-wise, Xamarin apps really follow the MVVM model quite well, especially if you're using Xamarin Forms, and it would make things complicated if you were splitting up the code between Objective-C and...
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the MVV model still persists then in Xamarin, much like it does a typical HTML, JavaScript library, CSS stack with, right now in .NET, MVC is what's in my mind to kind of facilitate that from a view standpoint.
Yeah, MVVM is definitely the pattern to go with as far as the Xamarin mobile apps go. It makes the most sense. I mean, you can really do whatever you want, but especially on the Android side, I mean, it's kind of the Wild West, but definitely MVVM, especially if you're going cross-platform,
Yeah.
Xamarin is a good solution.
I would imagine the binding would make it a lot easier to be different or universal across all platforms, and implementation to be unique and less troublesome going forward when we're coming back to that binding to the rendering.
Yeah. So for the data bindings, for the UI and the views basically, and I guess the MVVM pattern really works when you use Xamarin Forms, and that's how I've been using it. So that's why I say that, I guess. But you can use. They've got their own XAML specification, so it's not identical to Microsoft's that you're used to with like WPF.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's small things. For instance, you have a binding context instead of a data context, stuff like that for your view, and small things. But a lot of people, I would say, it's probably somewhere around 50%, maybe even the majority, don't even use XAML with Xamarin Forms. They're just doing everything programmatically in their views. It works really well. I think their XAML specification was relatively new, and it was missing lots of features. So I think a lot of people just got used to writing Xamarin Forms applications programmatically and skipping the XAML altogether. And that's what I've been doing, and it's been working pretty well. So.
Okay, and so that even the learning curve then even lightens because you can do that.
Yes.
I know there's a lot of developers out there who've never touched Microsoft's XAML stuff when they're doing mostly web stuff, and they haven't done WPF. They really haven't been into it. So to go back and try to swallow that might be a little bit of a learning curve, but if they don't need to, then they can pretty much jump right in then, can't they?
Yeah. It's just all C#. And you don't need to be scared of not knowing the native platforms like iOS and Android, because with Xamarin Forms, most of the time you're dealing with the UI and your own custom application layer, the view models, and then you have a service layer, and you can use all your familiar .NET NuGet packages and third-party libraries if they're supported in the PCL target platform that you're using, which most of them are nowadays.
Okay.
So they're all usable in your app if it makes sense to do so, and your favorite MVVM framework like MVVM Cross or MVVM Lite. Mobile developers for Windows Phone might be familiar with those. You don't got to worry about not knowing the native platforms. It's pretty easy to get around. And if you want to dive in and get access to everything that the native platform offers, it's very easy to do so, but you don't have to.
Okay. How are the renderings in between the platforms? Now I think PhoneGap, it was consistent, but I don't think it was exact. How is it in Xamarin? Is it pretty close? I mean, are they consistent to what we would expect of a native app?
Yeah, so you're talking about like the performance of the rendering and the UI and
performance, and even the visibility, where some things before may not have translated really nice, but now with Xamarin, are we looking at a screen to look native on an iOS device versus an Android device off that same base pretty easily, or do we have a couple of things yet that maybe still need to be ironed out?
No, that's a good question. It's got a very positive answer for Xamarin. So it's you can expect like 100% native performance.
Okay.
As far as Xamarin apps go, I mean they're very performant, and with Xamarin Forms, I think maybe there is a minor degradation in the performance of the UI, but it would still be better than what you would get from those other type of cross-platform frameworks. As far as the performance of the rendering goes, it still has the look and feel of a native application. I think the most problematic UI control as far as performance goes, just due to some memory leaks and misuse and misunderstanding of how it's used in Xamarin Forms, has been the list view. You know, if you've got a bunch of view cells with a ton of images, especially in Android, it's been problematic. But Xamarin has a really quick turnaround on bug fixes and releasing updates, and the community is pretty active too. And you know, if people are highlighting these bugs, they'll work with the community on the forums, and those enterprise reps, I think, get a lot of information from their clients, and they churn out bug fixes and releases to the Xamarin Forms NuGet package and the platform quite often. So as far as I've seen in the past like 6 months, the list view's been improved a lot, performance-wise especially. We've noticed on the Android side it was pretty bad, and now it's totally usable. So that said, the way the controls render in Xamarin Forms is very unique. They render as the native control, because what they're doing is binding to a native control. So you have the concept of these a Xamarin Forms UI element, a native UI element, and this render in between. And so the render and the Xamarin Forms element are part of the Xamarin layer, and that's what comes with Xamarin Forms. And basically everything, all the properties you give to your Xamarin Forms element, they get bound to the native element. So they expose basically the properties of the native element that they want to work with their platform, and then those would get rendered. So a button, an Android button, the same code would render an Android button like a default Android button on Android and an iOS button on iOS. They look different. The default properties are different. You know, your options are different. So they only expose the common ones. So it is a little bit like the lowest common denominator, basically, of what's available. But like, you can do so much with the common UI elements in these platforms nowadays. There's so much common between them. I mean, everyone has a button. Everyone's got a list view. You know, it doesn't impact you that much, and you can extend the renders in between to expose additional platform-specific properties. So, like, let's say I was using Xamarin Forms and I had some buttons on my page, and there's a special property on the Android buttons that isn't exposed through the Xamarin Forms render for the button, because it's not available on the iOS button. But I want to make use of that, maybe to control the bevel of the button shape. Well, I can extend the render class with a custom render that exposes that on the Android side and doesn't impact my iOS build at all. And I just put that into my native Android project instead of my Xamarin Forms portable class library, that custom render class. And so it's not used on the iOS side at all. And then I get the features from the Android app, from Android, without impacting my cross-platform application. I guess that ties into a little bit about the architecture of Xamarin apps, but maybe you guys have a question about that. I won't go off on a tangent too far.
I'd like to know more about the architecture.
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay, so this is something that's important to understand. I mean, when you're developing for Xamarin, the kind of the structure of your solution, the structure of your projects, and the packages you're building, is you have a project in your Visual Studio solution for each native application. So let's say I am going to create a new mobile app called Do Something, and excluding Xamarin Forms even, if you create a new Xamarin solution, you get the templates in Visual Studio when you install the Xamarin extension. it'll give you a native. Well, you can do it two ways. You can use a portable class library or a shared project for your Xamarin portion
Okay.
of the code, your cross-platform code, basically. And you have a native Android project and a native iOS project, and then your shared project or your PCL. I think the majority of people nowadays are using portable class libraries, pickles, PCLs, whatever. The shared projects, I don't know. I don't like getting all messy with those build flags and everything to separate out the logic, but it's really nice using a PCL. I think that's what I use. That's what I'll focus on.
Okay.
So basically, you have 3 projects if you're targeting Android and iOS. I'm going to exclude Windows Phone, even though I'm a Windows Phone fan. I have one, but I haven't used Xamarin with Windows Phone. So, and there are some caveats there because there's a lot of stuff you do and don't need versus iOS and Android because most of this stuff's already there in the platform. So, you have your cross-platform logic in your portable class library, and then you have your platform-specific stuff in your native projects, and they just reference your PCL. And if you're using Xamarin Forms, that NuGet package goes to all 3 projects, but all your views and view models, they go in your portable class library. And then if you're writing custom renders to expose additional features for the UI elements, you would put those classes in your native projects.
Okay.
And that's about it.
From a PCL standpoint, how easy is it to share code between projects to do different things? Is it pretty easy, or is it pretty self-contained in the ecosystem?
To share code between your two, like your iOS and Android project?
Let's say a couple of different projects. If you have kind of, in .NET sometimes you'll have a class library of kind of core code that you're working with. I don't know if a PCL is similar or can inherit, or inherit's a terrible word, if it can reference another assembly with that core code, if it can, somehow share that common core amongst different projects. Is that pretty easy to do?
Yeah, no problem at all. As long as like the separate assembly that you want to reference, maybe with some reusable code in it, is a PCL, and it targets your, I think it's called target platform. So,
Okay.
when with PCLs, you have different target platforms, that, so you have a PCL that might target like 5 platforms, like iOS, or like Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Android, .NET, and Silverlight. Well, the PCL target platform that I was using didn't target Silverlight, so you wouldn't be able to use a PCL or reference a PCL that was targeting the Silverlight build as well. You'd have to build it correctly, but otherwise, yeah, no problem.
Okay.
If I start a PCL and I target, just iOS, and then 5 months later I decide I want to add Android, can I add Android at that point, or do I kind of have to start over and know what I'm targeting from the get-go?
You could. You can change your target platform, and you can do it through the Visual Studio project properties dialog, or you can just go in and edit the project file and change the value. But to extend the target platform for your PCL, but I think if there were any issues with the platform you were adding, you'd have to make the modifications in your code. But for Xamarin, there shouldn't be any, because I don't think I think it's the only target platform that you can use for Xamarin has both included all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So a good example would be if I start an iOS and an Android, and then Windows Phone finally takes off, I want to just add that, to my existing solution, right? So that should theoretically be possible.
Right, and I mean, Windows Phone 10 is hopefully coming out this fall/winter, and everybody's going to need to update their PCL targets anyway, right, to support that. So.
Okay. Yep.
But I don't want to go any farther down that road, because that's where my knowledge ends on PCL targets. So.
Okay.
What about IoT kind of stuff? So outside of the mobile device, we're talking more of a non-display device, which is kind of weird because we're talking about more display, but maybe like a HUDs up on a thermostat, stuff like that. Is it to that level? Is it really more or less just kind of a core mobile phone type of and maybe phablet kind of tool?
Yeah, I don't know if they support those type of platforms like the Windows IoT stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not too savvy on that, but they do support Apple Watch, that SDK.
Okay.
So what is it, WatchKit or whatever? But yeah, that's supported, and I think there's some stuff to do with Android. I was only targeting mobile phones with Android, but there's a whole array of stuff you can hit there. And then Windows Store, OS X, I said, and obviously you could use Xamarin Forms for an iPad or tablet application.
Yeah, with more and more devices coming out, and a lot of them don't have a display, a HUDs up kind of thing, but thermostats and I think some other things may or may not. And I just kind of wanted to know if it would translate to those kind of devices, or if it's kind of there. So it's something to see and watch for, I suppose.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So, okay. So theoretically, with the SDK, and Zach, I know you're not a Sitecore dev. That's our job.
Yeah.
But theoretically, if you have Xamarin and you're using the Sitecore SDK, you could have one repository of content that gets pushed out to your website, to your Android app, to your iPhone app, to all those tablets that use it, and then to an Apple Watch. And assuming the SDK supports Sitecore personalization, which I honestly have no idea if it does or not, but if it does, you could then potentially personalize people's Apple, their phone, their watches, the Apple Watch thing. So you could say, oh look, Jamie, you just crossed the boundary into this township, and supply different content served up from Sitecore through Xamarin. That's pretty cool to me.
I think even one step on that, if it ties into knowing what kind of device, obviously, but then bringing that back to the profile card and be able to have that as another target of just from a person standpoint, kind of keeping that one profile card fits all. So if I had an Apple Watch, an Android, and iOS, not only would I have my pockets full everywhere I went and probably be overheated, but it could find out that knowledge for me and push content based on that, or cater.
Perhaps using the Sitecore engagement automation plans.
Yep.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds pretty powerful.
Hey,
I think marketers could do some fun things with that.
I think
possibly so annoying, but fun.
It always starts out as annoying. Remember the blinking text back in '96, Jamie?
Yes, the front end things we can do, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nobody does that anymore. Can Xamarin blink text? Because if it does, I'm kind of sad.
Yeah, I think they just put that in. That's
a new feature.
Yeah.
Heavily requested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is all great this is all great that we can go across all the different platforms, but it doesn't blink, man. We really need the blinking.
Sorry.
I need a blinking marquee to go across wherever we go. No, very cool. Yeah, I see the possibilities. Obviously, with the XDB and analytics, experience analytics. So it covers mobile. It looks native. Is there kind of a default with Xamarin? So in other words, Sitecore had this concept before responsive design of a device, and so you would use something like an agent sniffer to determine what device you were, and then pick your device, pick your layouts according to that device. Xamarin obviously covers the devices in mobile. Does it do anything with desktop, iOS, Mac kind of stuff? Is there kind of a default of desktop to that, or is it strictly just mobile and you're still looking to do something for that browser desktop presence of a site?
Well, that's a good question. So I've only used Xamarin. I've only targeted mobile. And that's all I've used Xamarin Forms for. Now, of course, if you were targeting desktop, you could very well forgo Xamarin Forms and use your native UI framework for that. So I can't even say necessarily if Xamarin Forms supports the desktop experience, but it definitely supports mobile in the context that you have pages as kind of your underlying UI element for every screen. That's kind of their concept. And you can orient your pages to detect if your device is landscape or portrait, right? And they do have in Xamarin Forms an idiom property that detects like what type of device you're on. But I think that only detects between phone and tablet are the two idioms that they currently support. And they've left it open, so I don't think it currently supports desktop, but it would work well for tablet and phone. That said, Xamarin and the Sitecore SDK could be used without Xamarin Forms on a desktop experience and an Apple Watch and work perfectly fine. You would just have to roll your own native UI for each platform you target, and it can be cross-platform.
Because the one thing that was supposed to fix that was responsive, right? I will write it one way, it'll work everywhere, not a problem, right? Sounds familiar, right? And it didn't quite come through exactly as that. So, when I'm developing something, I'd rather kind of do it once, but if I have to, separate that, I guess, for the ability to target mobile, that's not such a big deal. Especially if it's our kind of where you're natively starting in C# as a .NET developer anyway.
And Xamarin's adding features all the time. I mean, I would assume that eventually Xamarin Forms would support all the platforms they target. I think when they released it, they've just been throwing stuff out there all the time. They've got a ton of products and features for the Xamarin platform. I don't think they expected it to be such a big hit as it was. I think they kind of pitched it as more of a prototyping tool, Xamarin Forms, for mobile apps, and people just ran with it, and so then they threw a bunch of support on it and started churning out updates and adding features, and now it's like one of their primary products, I think, that people use. That said, I mean, they've got a ton of other stuff. Speaking of analytics frameworks, they've got Xamarin Insights, which is I think it's still in beta. We aren't currently using it, but it looks really powerful. It's a whole analytics framework they have for their native apps. They have a Xamarin Profiler, which kind of runs on top of the native profilers you would use for native apps, like instruments for iOS and Device Monitor for Android. So this profiler gives an extra layer of information for the whole .NET runtime that's running on top of the native layer. So they've got a lot of developer. The Insights analytics framework gives crash reporting, which is really useful for .NET. So they've got these diagnostic and developer tools that are really powerful that developers love, aside from just like the end user features that their products support. One thing I wanted to touch on before we forget is that if you're developing for iOS, you can't finish building an iOS app without a Mac, because your iOS application has to finish its packaging and code signing, at least as far as I understand, in Xcode or with tools behind Xcode. So.
And that's more of a process thing than a technical requirement, right? I mean, that's to be able to live kind of in Apple's ecosystem, more or less, correct? Right.
And I mean, just beyond that, the only thing you have to consider with iOS are things that any iOS developer has to consider versus Android, which is like it takes longer to publish to the App Store, blah, 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 because they have a longer approval time. But it's no different than any other native iOS developer or anybody that submitted an iOS app to the App Store would have to go through the same things to build the final application. But it does highlight an interesting thing on your kind of your developer setup. Your developer environment has to include a Mac somehow, and when you're building in Visual Studio, basically they've implemented this build host application that runs on your Mac, and you connect to it over the network, and then that just passes everything off to the Mac side, and it finishes the build there.
Okay.
So it's really hands-off once you get it set up. It's very cool. I think the dream setup is to have like a MacBook Pro, and you're running maybe Parallels,
Yeah.
and you're doing everything in Windows with Visual Studio, and you have the build host running on the Mac side, and it just all happens auto-magically. The other alternative is to have like a Mac Mini on your desk next to your awesome laptop. Connect that way. I'm lucky enough to have a MacBook Pro, and that setup with Parallels I fully support, but both work.
Will a Mac Mini work a little bit better for kind of a team environment, more of a team check-in, and have the Mac Mini kind of the build for that?
Yeah, so if you're talking like full software development lifecycle with continuous integration, all that stuff, what you're going to want to do for your cross-platform continuous integration server would be to have an OS X server or a Mac Mini running with OS X, and just have like Jenkins or TeamCity or something running there, building both your Android and iOS apps on the Mac side. That way you don't have to deal with like two separate build machines. And
as a Mac guy too, I'm not sharing my Mac with the rest of my team. There's only so much I'll share, but my Mac is mine, right?
Yeah, exactly. So don't share your Mac Mini or your MacBook Pro.
Well, I'll share the Mac Mini, right? In that environment, I'll throw the Mac Mini down and go, okay, that's where we do that, right? And everybody can get to it, whatever. But my MacBook Pro, no, that's mine.
Yeah,
that's, you know what I mean. So
a lot of people will develop Xamarin apps for iOS and OS X just using Xamarin Studio on the Mac, and they never even enter Visual Studio land or the PC world altogether. And you can do Android over there too. So if you're not concerned about targeting Windows in any way, or you don't have an affinity for using Windows as a development environment, then you can do everything on a Mac. So you can pick and choose your development environment as all the way down to the OS, which is pretty cool.
From a Sitecore perspective, I'm thinking that, well, it kind of depends on the mobile effort, but quite honestly, you'll probably have one developer with a MacBook Pro who's doing mobile to take care of a majority of that, and everybody else is probably in that same environment. You know, I use Parallels, so I mean, if I were to do it, that's how I would do it, unless I had really no core person that is really a front end guy, that we're all just kind of doing everything, like you said, back end kind of C# kind of stuff, and going forward with that, then maybe the Mac Mini makes a little bit more sense for a more larger team. Distributed team, probably a OS X server, definitely.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, Jamie? You look like you want to say something.
Let's move on from the Macs.
Yeah, you're not a Mac fan, are you?
No. Stupid Apple products.
It's a necessary evil.
Hey, you gotta love one of these, Jamie. Oh, look at that. Check that out. A little Descendants all the way around.
Especially if you're a Sitecore user. Have you ever tried using Sitecore on a Mac?
No, I just program it. I try not to use it on a Mac.
It's horrible.
I'm not saying nothing. I've had my occasional problem with Sitecore on a Mac with Safari.
Yes, Safari on a Mac with Sitecore. Good luck.
Chrome seems to be okay.
Yeah, well, it's Chrome. Stupid Apple products.
Hey, they make good hardware. I don't know about their software.
Yeah.
You can still run Windows and Parallels.
I like it all. I used to say it was the best Windows machine I ever bought, right? And you know, quite honestly, I'm getting used to us. We do all of our editing on a Mac, Jamie. Huh?
No.
We do.
Alright, moving on. How is Xamarin's documentation? If I'm jumping in, I'm bound to get lost. Will I find my way out?
You will. I have to say their documentation is pretty good. So there's two places you need to go. Stack Overflow, obviously. There's a lot of good posts there. But I think you should start at Xamarin. Just go to Xamarin.com. They've got a developer tab up top. I think it goes to developer.xamarin.com. And they got a ton of guides on all their different SDKs and APIs and tools. And then also their forums are a really active community. They've got great forums. The Xamarin customer success developers respond all the time on the forums. They're active every day. You get questions answered really fast there. I'd say like a 1-2 day turnaround at most. And most of the time I don't even have to post something. I just mooch off of everybody else's questions. And stuff works. I mean, people are actively solving problems there, and it's really helpful.
That's awesome.
You know, that's kind of funny. Then the enterprise, you know, I suppose you get a dedicated rep, and the SLA is probably the feel good factor to that. But you're seeing kind of the same response on a question that SLA really kind of upholds, correct? If I heard that right?
Yes. And that was always kind of my thinking, which is why we never went the Xamarin Enterprise route.
Okay.
But they let us demo a rep for a while.
Okay.
When we were struggling with our Android port, because we just targeted iOS first. And I say port, and it wasn't really a port because we didn't have to port anything. It was all cross-platform. But you still have to address the same type of issues you would address on either platform. We were doing things for our iOS app that just didn't work in Android at first. It had nothing to do with the Xamarin layer. It was just the way we were handling our bitmaps and loading those and stuff like that. And so our Android app wasn't as performant as our iOS one. So we wanted to fix that. So they let me talk to a Xamarin rep, and he was really helpful. I mean, you get basically face-to-face time, you know, almost as much time as you need to talk about your code and look over things. I mean, they've got NDAs they can sign so you can share code with them, and you know, they'll run their app on their devices. And they've got a lot of other tools, and they know how to use their tools the best, right? Obviously, I'd hope so.
Sure.
They've got things we haven't even talked about. I mentioned Xamarin Profiler, but they've got Xamarin Test Cloud, which basically, you know, they've got a farm somewhere where they've got 1,000 computers with every phone device in the world plugged into it, and basically you can deploy your builds onto these phones, and you get a bunch of test reports back. You can run automated tests there. They've got test frameworks for that, but you know, they'll do that for you if they are trying to diagnose something and help you out. And I experienced that, and I thought it was really great. That said, we never ended up paying for the enterprise license, but the help I got was really useful.
Very good.
Moving forward, I think that would be a good decision to go with.
You kind of mentioned the community of Stack Overflow being part of that. Sitecore's got a pretty strong community, pretty strong MVP community. What is that culture like in the Xamarin community? You know, you said it's a good community. So what are some of the characteristics of the Xamarin community? I just want to know if they parallel kind of to what we see in Sitecore, really. So, you know, some of the things like willingness to share, stuff like that. It sounds like that's there based on what we've been talking about. Yeah,
so I think a lot of people, you've kind of got four levels of people on the forums, Xamarin forums. And that's where I spend most of my time. Every once in a while I'll get directed to Stack Overflow, but usually I have to go there for just .NET specific questions. If it's Xamarin forums specifically, the Xamarin forums are the best place. And there's four types of people there. You've got your Xamarin developers, the Xamarin reps, making posts. Then you've got these guys that get the title of Xamarin MVP. And they're super helpful, and they've earned it. They've either, you know, responded to about 1 million questions on the forums, or they've got, you know, their own NuGet packages of Xamarin Form extension libraries on GitHub somewhere that they've been sharing with people that have become like downloaded a couple hundred times or 1,000 times. So these guys are very knowledgeable. They're sharing source code. They're solving people's problems, and then you've got kind of the average Joe developer, and then you've got the newbies. So you've got those four groups. But you know, also Xamarin runs on top of Mono, which has been around for a long time. So you've got a lot of experienced Mono developers. You can find a lot of those deeper questions on Stack Overflow as well. So you know, that's kind of the spread of where you'd go to find the certain answers.
It's good to hear that they have an MVP community and they kind of recognize, you know, top performers in their space. does Xamarin have a is it like Mongo, is it like Sitecore where it has like a partner program or a service partner? Is it kind of just, here's Xamarin, here's what we embrace, everyone please use?
It's more like that. They've got 3 types of releases of all their I guess developer SDKs. So not all their products, because that would include some of their developer tools, but like their SDKs, like Xamarin Forms or the Xamarin iOS or Xamarin Droid SDKs, which you basically get with the Xamarin extension. You can either install the alpha, beta, or stable release, and they've got at least one new alpha release coming out every week. Maybe every other week you get a new beta build, and with new features and bug fixes, and then your stable releases are coming out like maybe once a month. I think seems to be the release cadence, and I think a lot of people are willing to try out at least the beta releases and are vetting the bug fixes that they're putting in there, and then talking about it on the forums. So usually I tend to just stick with stable releases for stuff, but in development of our mobile app, I've often gone to the beta release to test things out and found that there's some bug fixes there that just popped up in the community like 2 weeks ago, and they've already got it in a beta release or an alpha release, and it's been really useful. So I think that's kind of how they don't have like an early access program or something like that.
Okay.
They might, with some of their enterprise customers, get to try out new tools first or get things for free. Like I think if you purchased a Xamarin Enterprise license within the last few months, you're guaranteed to have Xamarin Insights, their analytics framework, for free for the next year, because it's actually coming out of beta in like a month, supposedly. So, then you have advantages like that, but that's where it breaks down.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, can I develop a mobile game using Xamarin?
Yes. You can do it 2 ways, where you're actually using like a really popular gaming engine. They've ported the Cocos 2D game engine for Xamarin, so they ported it to be used with Xamarin. So you wouldn't use Xamarin Forms. I think you instead would kind of replace Xamarin Forms with this Cocos 2D layer. Forget what it's called in Xamarin, the SDK, but you could get it as a NuGet package just like you would get Xamarin Forms. Basically, it's an extra layer on top of your Xamarin app for iOS and Android, and it gives you all the stuff you'd want from the Cocos 2D community. I mean, it's essentially a port of the Cocos Sharp port of Cocos 2D, which I think was originally for iOS. I could probably be saying that wrong too, but yeah, it's totally there. And then they also have another game engine, Monogame, I think, which is better if you're targeting like a 3D type game instead of just your average 2D mobile game.
Okay, so those includes like a physics engine and everything else.
Yeah, physics
framework.
engine. Yeah. The whole game loop, mumbo jumbo. Yeah.
So we are a step closer to having Sitecore content power a game. That's my dream. Someone out there make that happen. I want Sitecore to power a game.
Build it, man.
That would be cool.
That would be real cool.
Yeah. Jamie, you can just build that in your spare time.
Yeah, in my spare time. I have so much of that.
So about the game thing, I think it's Visual Studio Toolbox is a show on Channel 9. I hope you don't get mad at me for advertising another show on here.
Oh,
never.
James Montenegro, he's the Xamarin evangelist I mentioned. He does a talk on on gaming with Xamarin on there, and I've watched part of it, and it looked really interesting.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in games, check that out. You get started there.
Channel 9 always has good stuff.
Yes.
All right.
Mark, any other questions?
I don't. I think this is something that definitely should be looked at. Right now I think a lot of people in the Sitecore community are looking responsive. Right? There's been blog posts. I think you actually had one, Jamie, about responsive or not to responsive. That is the question.
Yeah.
This brings in another fold, which seems that the learning curve for devs should be a little bit lighter. It seems to be lightweight across. You know, if you're gonna do iOS, you need to bring a Mac into the picture, which is probably, you know, good for people like Jamie. I think it works out really, really well. So, you know, it's something to look at. The SDK is there, folks. You know, take a peek. Zach, thank you very much for enlightening us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Anytime.
I hope I didn't confuse you too much. No.
Well, we're easily confused to begin with. Yeah. We like shiny objects and stuff, right? So we're easily directed, but you kept us focused today. It was all good.
Cool.
Yes, very good. Thank you, Zach.
Glad to be here.